We beginnen nu met de workshop van Piet Blackshaw, getiteld Dancing with Megaphones. Piet is van Nielsen Basmetrics, dochteronderneming van VNU, de organisator van dit congres. En wij zaten net te speculeren welk bedrijfsonderdeel van VNU het eerst verkocht gaat worden tijdens de grote break-up van de private equity partij die nu eigenaar is van VNU. Dus behalve zieke humor is het ook een man die heel veel gedaan heeft in online media en in event business tot advertising. Hij begon bij Procter & Gamble, verantwoordelijk voor online advertising, al heel vroeg. En ook, wat ik erg leuk vond, online issues en rumor management. Online sampling, database marketing en dan alle andere buzzwords die in de jaren 90 zo'n beetje opgeld deden. Zat hij echt heel dik in. Hij ging weg al, vrij snel. Eind 95 begon Planet Feedback. Dat werd gekocht door IntelliSeek. En dat werd weer verkocht aan Basmetrics. So you actually cashed out 3 times in the same company? On the way up, Pete, or on the way down? You'll tell me. Way down. Yeah, I did one of those. Nosedive. Piet is nu Chief Marketing Officer bij Nielsen Basmetrics. Dus het bedrijf dat een meetmethode ontwikkelde. En ik lees het even voor, want ik wil het goed zeggen. Ontwikkelde een meetmethode voor consumer-generated media. En wij kennen het vooral omdat het bekend is van Blogpulse, de search tool. Hij is ook nog een keer medeoprichter van de Word of Mouth Marketing Association. Vond ik ook grappig. Dus niet de traditionele marketing, maar de Word of Mouth marketing. Nou goed, het thema van Piet waar hij het over gaat hebben, kan hij veel beter zelf zeggen. Maar het consumer-generated media, dat is zijn ding. En daar gaat het dan. Het woord is aan een hele grote jongen uit de branche, Piet Blackshaw. Come on up.
Thanks. Thanks so much for the invite. I'm absolutely delighted and excited to be here. When we were, our company was acquired by V&U Nielsen. One of the things I really look forward to is getting involved in more global presentations, partly because I'm such a curious learner about what's going on, and I've had an absolutely amazing experience interacting with many of the vendors, and I look forward to talking to more of you. The title is Dancing with Megaphones, and I just think that's a perfect title for where we are right now in the internet, because consumers are taking greater power and they are running around with megaphones on steroids. They are absolutely impacting the marketplace, and all of us in the advertising and marketing community are trying to figure out what the heck is going on, and more importantly, can we manage in that environment? Can we influence the sentiment? And that's what we're going to focus on here. Since I'm here in Rotterdam, I figured I would open with a wee bit of buzz analysis, not in depth, but the speakers last night were treated to an absolutely incredible dinner last night by our host from the city of Rotterdam, and we talked a lot about buzz and how to build promotion for the city. And so I thought I would kind of look, we have a tool called Blog Pulse, which monitors about 36 million blogs on a daily basis and growing. So I thought I'd take a little look and see how, the city of Rotterdam's doing relative to Holland in general, or also, is there any buzz yet about the conference in the context of Rotterdam? And there's a few comments, but not a lot, and I think that all of us that feel satisfied with this conference, it's our duty to obviously go to the blogs and the message boards and spread the buzz. If you look at, here are just a few of the smattering comments, but again, what you often find is before an event, there may be a few comments, sometimes by hugely influential parties, sometimes by average consumers, but I suspect as we speak, bloggers are out there adding much, much more content, and that's the type of content that will ultimately fuel perceptions, reputation around this type of event. So it'll be interesting to look at how the comment flows increase over time based on whether you in the audience are satisfied. Here's some of the top lines that I'd like to cover. Some of the key themes. The new consumer landscape. I mean, what is really happening with consumers? And it's and I will say this, it's very clear, while there are important nuances between the area that I'm most focused on, the US, there's no question that either Europe is at parity with where we are, in some cases ahead, sometimes a little bit behind. So I think there's some very, very good parallels. So I think that the themes will resonate. We'll talk about consumer-generated media, a term that I coined about 3 years ago, but never imagined in a million years that it would become what it is today. And it means many things to different parties, but we'll talk about how it's evolving. We'll talk about consumer-generated multimedia, which I think for a lot of us is where we're seeing a major paradigm shift. We'll talk about measurements, which I think all of us that are pushing advertising campaigns, you can't manage, you can't market what you can't measure. And so we'll talk about how this is a space that can be measured in ways that marketing could never be analyzed before. And then we'll open up, we'll talk a little about where it's headed and a few questions. So the big trends out there, I mean, clearly consumers are in control. And I know as marketers, we tend to romanticize that comment. Sometimes we get a little bit hyperbolic about consumers taking over, but it really is occurring. And we've seen in our company an incredible evolution in how consumers have taken much greater control over the marketing landscape. At the same time, we have massive media fragmentation. Certainly in the US, I think even as we get to the mobile environment, media is fragmenting all over the place, which presents both challenges and opportunities. You know, attention remains elusive, although we're seeing some instances such as the, Linden Labs model, where obviously consumers are very, very focused on certain models, but generally, relative to the way marketers used to measure attention, it's much, much more elusive. Broadband is changing the game in a really big way. I don't need to spend a lot of time telling this audience about that, but it is changing the context of consumer expression. On demand is huge, and I think that fits into the whole model of consumer control because consumers are choosing the content that they find of preference. Your challenge as marketers is, what is the content that will entertain them, satisfy an unmet need, serve them, and so forth? The global blogosphere is marching on. I probably had a pretty parochial view about this a couple years ago, and I've been humbled by the extent to which China has practically leapfrogged the US, the extent to which Europe, the European blogosphere. I was just reading a study about blogs in France, and I was talking to some folks last night about here in Holland, the growth of the blogosphere. I think we have a major trend towards globalization. Again, I think that generally spells opportunities, but it also spells a lot of challenges. And then the other piece that I would add is, and this is a really big deal back in the US and probably here as well, but brands are discovering so-called engagement, which means they're thinking about measurements beyond reach and frequency. In fact, the Advertising Research Federation, this is their #1 initiative. And now all of us, it begs the question, well, what is engagement? What we know for sure is that it means it's a deeper level of consumer involvement with advertising. And the good news when consumers are armed with megaphones is that they are giving us lots of clues about how they feel about advertising. And then the last thing I would add, partly because it's been in the news so much in the last few days, is what we call the co-creation. And actually a lot of the vendors here are in the co-creation game. In fact, I participated in a few of their ad models. But GM just announced that they are creating a contest for the best Super Bowl ad, and it's targeted to teens. Frito-Lay just announced today that one of their Super Bowl ads will be created by consumers. But advertisers are trying to figure out, how do we dance with megaphones to co-create meaning for our brands? Easier said than done. One of my themes will be, you have to listen before you figure it out. So let's talk about the basics. Consumer-generated media. The reason why we call it media versus content, and there's a lot of terms out there, UGC, just every day someone comes with a new term. I like the term media because it underscores the fact that when consumers have an opinion about a brand, product, or service, it acts like media. It impacts purchase behavior. At the end of the day, marketing is about awareness, trial, and repurchase of products, and consumers are now creating the media that is moving us one way or the direction. And it's largely created by consumers, although just about every media source is borrowing from consumer behavior. Media writers, for example, are adopting the blog publishing format as a way of better communicating their content, but it's largely borrowed from what a lot of consumers have been doing on TypePad, LiveJournal, a lot of the European blogs and the like. Now, I sometimes feel dubious when people say, Pete, you're an expert in CGM. I have been very humbled by how quickly it is evolving. When I first started this company called Planet Feedback, which was a focus group of consumer opinion, rants and raves about companies, and then we merged with IntelliSeek, and we were literally drinking out of the fire hydrant of commentary from Usenet news groups. Does that ring a bell with anybody here? They were the early internet forums, millions of them. And then we blinked. And then other internet discussion forums emerged. And we had auto forums, feedback portals, micro community sites, chat instant messages, Yahoo groups, advanced chat. And if you notice, I haven't even gotten to the blog part. This is like phase one consumer-generated media. And for a lot of brands, this was creating massive headaches because rumors would flow really fast through the CGM pipe. And then all of a sudden, the consumer blogs came around. And they've been around for a while, but they didn't really find media attention until the last 24 months. And then we had media blogs that borrowed from them, and then marketer blogs, and then so-called tagging, where consumers were classifying their content. And then we moved into what I characterize as CGM squared, which is consumer-generated multimedia. And we had moblogs, where consumers were posting photos directly to blogs. Then we had audio blogs, which many consider to be synonymous with podcasting. And then the vlogs. Think of all the vloggers that were active around the World Cup in the last couple months. And that's the whole multimedia form of blogging expression. And then, of course, podcasting. But the point is this. We're seeing a very rapid progression of consumer expression to higher impact orders of kind of magnitude and persuasion, and that has massive, I repeat, massive consequences for brands, both on the positive side, but also on the exposure and the negative side, and that's largely the business that we're in. I'll skip through this. Lots of different ways. Product review site, CGM squared. This just gives you a sense of some of the growth. I mean, podcasting, interesting, is relatively flat, and I think it hasn't really pushed mainstream from, I think you see a lot of it in the B2B space. It hasn't really been a super huge, consumer area. Obviously, the photo sharing is off the charts, and the video is, I frankly think this may even underestimate the growth of video, but video is absolutely exploding, and again, generally an opportunity, but lots of challenges, and we've been, to some extent, our business is not only helping companies figure out how to do good word-of-mouth marketing, but we also, we're kind of a rescue mission for brands that do it horribly wrong and have just been dogpiled by consumers out there that didn't like what they did. And video is really changing that equation. This just, again, I won't get into the details here, but this is actually from ComScore that just shows how quickly the video space has exploded. And again, mostly opportunity, but some big challenges. Brands are engaging. It's not all 100% organic, initiated by consumers. Coke is one of our clients, and they recently sponsored the World Cup bloggers, where they invited a bunch of European vloggers to videocast. They didn't necessarily pay them, but they had a free loft where you could have all sorts of drinks other than Pepsi. And in the process, they created a lot of content. They didn't say you have to go vlog about Coke, but they created an environment. That's a good example of co-creation. And I think we're going to see a lot of experiments by brands globally in this particular area. The reason why all of this is so important, and we've done most of our research in the US, but I've seen some of the other studies that vet this out. Consumers trust other consumers more than they trust advertisers. And I think that as advertisers continue to push intrusive, interruptive, invasive ad models, that principle will continue to hold true. And this is from a pretty elaborate study, and if you're interested, I'm happy to share it. It's about a year old, so I'm not as worried about sharing it openly. But we got into all the different variables of trust, and it's too simple to say consumers trust other consumers versus advertisers. There's important nuances. Among friends, MySpace is a big deal because it is, although it's a massive space, it's also pockets of familiars, social networks, and what they say about a brand can have massive impact. But positive word of mouth from someone personally ranks number one. Positive word of mouth from a credible source online is very, very high. But if you look at this, and I won't get into specifics, but all the traditional models push further down. And this is why advertisers are beginning to really get into the CGM space, because they're in search of trust. They're in search of credibility. They're in search of authenticity. transparency, all the things that we as consumers, not as marketers, really value as we develop our loyalty towards brands. Now, I will say a word about blogs, and I want to personalize this because I think as marketers we tend to get way too abstract. So I'm a parent, a recent parent of twins, and it is an absolutely life-changing event. And what's going on in the blogosphere is this very organic and sincere desire to network with others, to be heard, to express ourselves. And what happens is that these life-changing moments are going to the blogosphere. And so in my case, I've probably uploaded 50 videos. I mean, you may consider it to be boring, but among parents that are really into the nuances of diaper changing, they're into it. And of course, it answers the inevitable question for my relatives, how are the kids doing? And so, and what's interesting about this platform is that I'm using a tool, and there are many of them out there, where I'm using the deluxe version and I'm paying about $20 a month for the all-you-can-eat blog services. And it's funny because I've had friends at P&G that have said, man, your blog's better than our brand website. And there's a lot of truth to that. The barriers to entry for self-expression have so pushed down that consumers are creating compelling, engaging content. My goal is not to have 1 million people look at my blog. I simply want my network to feel connected to me. But what you see here is taking place millions and millions of times over. And I think as brands, part of our challenge is to figure out what is it that we can put in front of the consumer that helps them to fulfill those needs, and to do it in a way that doesn't feel like intrusive advertising. But this is a really, really big driver. And I'll give you another perspective. So I was co-leading interactive marketing at P&G in the late 90s, and websites were just ridiculously expensive, and every time you threw an order over to the agency, they came back with this really expensive, we want to do video, and the cost was just prohibitive. What's going on now is that I think consumers are teaching marketers a lot about how to be efficient, how to be iterative, how to communicate in ways that really connect. And that's why this whole principle of listening is so critically important. The other thing that's important about bloggers is, marketers are always asking me, so how do I find the influencers? And part of my answer is, although I'm a researcher in part, I try to tell them not to be too scientific. There are some certain magic questions that help you quickly vet out who has more influence. Bloggers tend to amplify at much greater rates. So if you are doing a segmentation analysis on your consumers, you may want to throw away some of the demographic questions that don't mean as much in the social media world, and you may just ask consumers, are you a blogger? And if you know who's a blogger within your brand franchise, that is a great starting point for who gets the samples first, who gets the free news first, who do you talk to first? Because again, the psychology of influencers is know it first and tell it first. But we need to know who within that franchise. And if you look at this study, and again, if you leave your card, I'll send this to you, bloggers over-index on putting photos online, putting videos online, creating their own website. So it's a good starting point for knowing who is really impacting the marketplace. This is the slide that always convinces senior management that this is a much bigger deal. Oftentimes you'll talk to market researchers and they'll tell you these are not typical consumers, they are not rep panel, they do not forecast to general population. And I always come back and I say, well, the consumers with megaphones are speakers, and they generally feed into the search engines which serve the seekers. The seekers are your typical consumers. And so what's happening is that you have these outspoken consumers with megaphones that, whether through blogs, boards, ratings and review sites, social media sites, are feeding content that ultimately tees up to typical buyers. And not only typical buyers, but other influencers. Where a lot of companies are getting burned right now is that financial analysts, reporters, lawyers, competitors are going to Google, they're typing in the brand, and what they see are a whole series of nastygrams about the brand. Or they may see something that's affirmative towards the brand. And this is very, very disruptive. And this is where the megaphone the online megaphone is having a disproportionate impact relative to talking offline because it leaves a digital trail. And everything we do in marketing leaves brand residue. And a lot of agencies are leaving horrendous brand residue because they're not being very thoughtful about how they embark upon programs. And some agencies are leaving a wonderful digital trail that's ultimately indexed through Google. And here's a very good example. So, I hope I have not frozen. It could be a sign. Okay, here we go. So here's an example. You type in IAMS. Most of what shows up is from activist groups. It's almost like you had a store shelf that said, danger, don't talk to me. And this is what marketing needs to be sensitized to. Most of what we're trying to figure out on search optimization is how to buy these keywords in the periphery. But what really impacts consumer behavior is what they see in the middle. And part of brand management moving forward is thinking about how these consumers with megaphones are impacting the shelf. You know, think about what A.G. Lafley, the CEO of P&G, keeps saying. The first moment of truth, what people see at the shelf, is what dictates a huge amount of the ultimate purchase behavior, then trying the product. Well, this is what happens online. People see the shelf, and what consumers are saying is increasingly filling up that shelf. Now, the good news is it can be quantified, and this is one reason why I really love my job, because all of this conversation be quantified, packaged, and used as really valuable intelligence. And there's a number of firms doing this. In fact, there's I think a firm called Buzz Research, and they have a product called Buzz Basics out of the Netherlands that I just met a little bit ago. But there's a lot of folks that are really adding value to clients by quantifying the conversation. And it's a very, it can be a very elaborate process. I won't get into the detail of how the technology works, but you can put the data in different buckets. And here, just to kind of get you thinking about what can you measure, you can clearly measure volume. How many people are talking about your brand? The reach, how many people are being impacted? That's where the search engine data counts for a lot. Dispersion, to what extent does it start in a blog but end up on a message board? To what extent does it expand? That's really important if your brand's in trouble. That's really, really important. And everyone needs to figure out, is a rumor or is word of mouth finding a tipping point? Sentiment, is it positive or negative? The nice thing about smart technology is that you can put it all into a calculus and figure out, are they for me or against me? Or is there a certain degree of emotion? What specific issues are working? We work, electronics and auto are two of our biggest categories, and we can tell GM or Ford with high confidence, you know, most people are talking about customer service, they're talking about parts that don't work, they're talking about, you know, the engine, but it can be quite granular. In fact, some companies, we may have 100 different categories for auditing. The source, where the conversation comes from, is a big deal. If a rumor starts on MySpace and seems small, I would say beware. That's like the blip on the radar that may kind of grow and become really ugly. If it's on Joe's blog and nobody links to Joe's blog, you probably can go to sleep without freaking out. Is the author credible? So a lot of different things that you can measure, and all of you that are managing campaigns, with or without buzz metrics, with or without blog research, should be thinking about how to stay on top of this. Here's some of the areas where we generally find that the megaphones really, really matter. New product launch. You really want to listen when you're launching a new product, because the mavens, the connectors, the outspoken consumers tend to be most vocal. And remember, it's because of that desire to know it first and tell it first. This is why how you diffuse the news is so important. Movie studios are very, very good at figuring out how to release information as early as 12 months before the movie launch to figure out how they can create free advertising, but there's a whole art. The other piece is that if you are screwing up, let's say your advertising is really angering consumers, you can retool based on that insight. In fact, a lot of what companies will do based on what we measure is retool their website, or tell their agency to chill out, or improve the product, retool customer service, rethink the way they buy keywords on Google. There's a lot of actionable steps you can take on it. So these are just some of the quadrants. Quality is interesting. companies are beginning to really think about consumer conversation as the next order of Six Sigma quality. Toyota is a very good example. Toyota, it's interesting, their approach to this is there's no such thing as statistical insignificance in the social media world. Why? Because it's like one Dell laptop that has a bad experience can go across the entire web. So you almost have to think differently about the long tail and the aberrations. And as you're thinking about total quality, you may have to retool your mindset about statistical insignificance, because anything can become viral. And at the end of the day, all that viral activity acts as advertising. And someone is accountable for that. You can do a lot of media auditing against this type of data. So if you look at the top part, these are the conventional online metrics, the click, the opt-in, the transaction. The more consumer-centric view is the post, the video, the 800 call, the reference, the reco, the referral, a love letter, a hate letter. This gets into real consumer texture. Now let me give some examples just to kind of get out of the clouds for a moment. Here's an example where, you look across all of the electronics companies, and electronics is our biggest category, and you might look at volume relative to sentiment. And they don't always sing together. Sometimes sentiment may be flat across all the players, but obviously the question is, well, why does Sony get so much reference? And you almost need to break that into subcomponent parts. But you can look at, why is Toshiba getting the lowest sentiment? Why are people less favorable to the brand? And that's where you really want to open that up and figure out what's driving that perspective. Is it customer service? Is it they don't feel like the product works? Here's around a product launch for Coke Black, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, found its initial introduction in, I think, bars in Europe. I think that's where it first started. But when did it find its peak? Did it peak at the right time? And most importantly, when it peaked, was it positive? And what did they say? And what might